Welcome to the 4th Lunch and Learn High Tunnels 2015 online workshop. I'm Cheryl Burns. I'm the Project and Outreach Manager for the Capital Resource Conservation and Development Area Council. Capital RC&D is a nonprofit organization that works to conserve natural resources and promote economic development. We primarily work in a 7-county region within south central Pennsylvania, but occasionally we have the opportunity to host projects that support the entire state, such as offering support for high tunnel growers. The Lunch and Learn series is a component of Capital RC&D's High Tunnel Support Program that's funded through partnership with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in Pennsylvania, and in collaboration with professionals who've been very generous with their time and talent in agreeing to present through this series. For today's session, Year 2 and Beyond High Tunnel Soil Health for the Experienced Grower, we're excited to collaborate with Chris Lent, who is an agricultural specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you find the information valuable. So without additional delay, I'll turn the session over to Chris. Chris?
Yes, thank you, Cheryl, and thanks everybody for joining us. My name's Chris Lent, as Cheryl said, and I'm with NCAT and the ATRA program, which I'm going to explain in a little bit. But I'm here to talk to you about managing soils in high tunnel production in the second year and beyond. We did an earlier high tunnel lunch and learn earlier in the spring on how to prepare the site and how to get high tunnel into production when you're first starting, and now we thought we'd follow up with a year 2 and beyond. Just a little bit of background on myself and the organization that I'm with. I'm going to advance the slides here. Okay. There we go. Everybody should be seeing the second slide now. That's my email. I'll have that. I have that also attached to the handouts. Handouts in this case are attached to this webinar, and they are just a few of the slides that I'm going to be showing you that have resources listed on them, and so you can have access to them without having to try to copy them down or go back and look at the whole presentation again to find them. But that's my email address. I'll repeat it at the end also. I work with NCAT, National Center for Appropriate Technology. They've been around for a long time, since the late 70s actually, helping people with energy issues at that time, and that's still a large part of what we do is energy conservation and alternative energy. But they also administer a program called ATRA, A-T-T-R-A, which is what most farmers know us through. It's an educational service for sustainable farmers, and we provide information and resources on all types of sustainable farm issues. We have a great website. This is a screenshot of the front page of our website. You can see all the categories that we have information and resources on that relate to farming and relate to sustainable energy on the farm. We also have an 800 number that's listed here on the screen that you can call with any questions that you might have, and you can be put in touch one-on-one with a agricultural specialist to ask any questions you might want. That's a free service. We have over 400 different publications available on all of these issues that you see listed here. And we do workshops and conferences and webinars like this as well to do outreach. So this is a free service that any of you can utilize anytime throughout the year as you run into questions and problems on your farm. A little background on myself. I ran a certified organic diversified vegetable operation for 10 years up in northeastern PA here, and it was called Lent's Organics. I had a small 50-member CSA. We did marketing at farmers markets and to restaurants, and the whole 9 yards. And we also did some livestock production for our CSA members. After that, I worked for an energy company doing solar and wind design and install work. So as an aside, if you have any questions on alternative energies, I'd be a good one to contact on those issues as well. But today we're here to talk about, production in high tunnels, and I just want to take one or two slides to recap a little bit of what I talked about in the first presentation, just to get our mindset of how unique the conditions are inside these structures and how to start thinking about production inside these structures. What it basically becomes is an irrigated desert. You run into, once you put the plastic over the top of the structure, no rain flow, you're controlling all of the water that goes inside of the structure, and that becomes very important in managing the soils and other management aspects of the high tunnels. So you're also moving to the south as far as frost hardiness zones are concerned. I mean, if you read any of Coleman's work, he has kind of shown that every time you put a layer of plastic over these crops, you're ending up moving a zone and a half to the south. So by the time you get a layer on the outside and a layer on the inside, if you're doing winter growing, you've basically moved 3 zones to the south. So you're moving onto a different farm every time you walk into one of these structures on your farm. Water tends to move up in these structures. In field production, of course, the rain is always flushing the water down and through the soil, if the soil is healthy. But in these systems, water is trying to move up all the time. You've got evaporation, you've got transevaporation through the plants, and so what ends up happening is nutrients tend to be pushed to the surface of the soil and build up towards the soil surface, which can result in a soluble salt buildup coming from the mineral salts in the fertilizers that are used in these structures. And that soluble salt buildup can end up coming up into the root zone, building up in the root zone, and can become a toxicity problem for your plants. So we're going to talk a lot about nutrient buildup today and how to manage it. There's also intensive growing conditions a lot of times in these systems. So you're asking a lot of the soil. You're trying to grow intensively to get the most out of a valuable space, and you run into problems as far as soil health sometimes because of that. You're asking a lot of the soil. It's also hard to incorporate rotation and cover cropping, 2 of the most useful tools for soil health are oftentimes eliminated from these structures because it's so hard to fit them in. So we're going to try to talk about that a little bit too. What this basically does, as far as its effect on the soil, these unique conditions of growing inside of the tunnel, it increases the average daily temperatures, which makes the plants grow a lot more quickly, and that's one of the advantages of high tunnel growing, but it also, the side effect is there's more nutrient demand because of that. So a lot of times there's recommendations for doubling the amount of nutrients to put on these plants that are growing in a high tunnel structure, when in fact that might be overdoing it, and you might be building up nutrient problems in the soil if you take that advice. The other thing is the soil temperatures are increased, not just the air temperature. So soil organic matter breaks down more quickly. There's a lot more soil biological activity when the temperatures are higher in the soil, and for longer periods during the year. So soil organic matter can be hard to keep that percentage of soil organic matter up, which is a real good indicator of the health of your soils, the percentage of soil organic matter, or it's one of the indicators. So we talked about the nutrient salt buildups. That's one of the effects. And then irrigation becomes very important, the amount and the type of system control you have, because where that water goes is going to affect where the soil biology is, where mineralization is happening of the organic matter, where the nutrient availability is, and where the roots are going to be able to go for nutrients. So that becomes a very important part of this. And what are we able to manage? Now, site selection I covered in the first webinar earlier in the spring. If you want to take a look at that, that affects a lot of a lot of things throughout the management of these high tunnels, the site selection and the preparation before the tunnel even goes up. But what we can continually manage in year two and beyond is the soil fertility, the health of the soil, and moisture levels through a lot of different means. Those are the things that we're going to focus on through the talk today. Again, the objectives up to year one or through year one, you basically are using regular soil tests to get your pH adjusted. In the first year, get your nutrients basically at optimal levels, and start working on your soil organic matter. These are the initial things that you're working on as far as soil management for your high tunnel. It's very similar to field management. And you're also working on getting good soil structure built, and so that the water, air, and roots can infiltrate down into the soil, and trying to install and manage the right irrigation system. So that's all the things that we covered in year one. We're thinking about the physical, biological, and chemical side of things in the soil, which is good soil fertility management or soil health management. And then in year two and beyond, what we can add is a list of tools to help us manage that soil health and manage the fertility so that we don't have nutrient buildup problems. One thing we're going to talk about is saturated media extraction test. This is a test that gives you the intensity of the nutrients that are available in the solution in the soil, instantly available to the plants. So it's very different from a Malic 3 extraction method, where that's telling you what the soil nutrient holding capacity of the soil is. This is telling you what's available right away. So it's something that high tunnel producers are starting to look at as a way to manage their nutrients a little more accurately. Always want to test for soluble salt levels, of course, because that's something that you may have to manage over time if you have continuous cover on these structures. There's another tool, a Pre-Sidedress nitrogen test, that can help pinpoint the exact amount of nitrogen that you could want to put on the soil and add to your fertility program. We're going to talk about that. There's also foliar testing for those who aren't using foliar testing already. We can talk about how to implement that and what it does, what it can do for you. There's also the matter of water analysis, which, because of the systems that we're talking about, because they rely so heavily on irrigation and the water that you're applying, the type of water you're using and the mineral content of the water you're using and the nutrient content can be exaggerated and have an impact on the soils inside these structures. And then we're going to talk about managing for diseases and pests, how to manage soils in particular for those things. I'll touch on that a bit. The saturated media extraction test is a test that's been around for a long time for greenhouse soil medium. It's not been used widely yet for just regular soil testing in high tunnel production. It is starting to be used more widely in the New England, in areas of New England. Vern Grubinger has been touting it as a great high tunnel soil nutrient test, and so has Bruce Hoskins up at University of Maine. And I'm going to give you some resources for the work that they've done on this. It measures concentrations that are immediately available of nutrients in the soil. So whatever is in solution that isn't binding to the clay or organic matter particles, this test will tell you what's in solution, and that gives you a better idea of how to monitor the intensity of the nutrients that are available right away, and you may be able to adjust your nutrient regime inside your high tunnel more accurately with this test. There's also results being, well, I want to mention, we don't have this around here. A lot of the labs around here don't test regular soils for this. I'll be showing you some labs that are available for using for soil testing in a minute here, but the University of Maine, which doesn't do us a lot of good down here, but they actually have a long-term high tunnel package as part of their soil testing offerings, and it's for tunnels that have been covered continuously for 3 years. It tests for all of these, for pH and soluble salts, and all of the nutrients, micro and macronutrients, and organic matter content using the soil, the saturated media extraction method. And then they can make organic fertilizer recommendations. It's a $22 test, so very, very nice to have that available for high tunnel growers. Down here, we don't have packages like that put together yet, or at least I don't know of labs that are doing this type of thing down here. This is a publication. This website at the bottom of this slide is a publication by Bruce Hoskins from University of Maine, describing this test and the usefulness of the test and how to interpret it for purposes of high tunnel production. That will be that's included in the handout, so you don't need to copy that down. But then there are recommendations and optimal soil levels set for certain crops now using the SME test. On the left-hand side here are the optimal levels that your test should come back for tomatoes, for instance. And that shows you where the nutrient levels should be optimally. And then on the right-hand side, these are recommendations using different organic fertilizers and the amounts you need to apply per 1,000 square feet. And it's nice to have it broken down into the smaller 1,000 square feet for high tunnel production in order to raise the parts per million of the nutrient you're trying to raise by 10 points for nitrogen on the top there, for instance. And then if you go down to the second line, it's potassium to raise that by 2 points, 2 parts per million. So there's very specific recommendations for fertilizer in order to utilize this SME test. I think we need to, as growers start asking about it at the labs, I have talked to, this is right off of the Maryland Extension site, University of Maryland Extension. It's just a list of labs in our neck of the woods that it was put together for gardeners, but of course they work with farmers as well. And I talked to Pennsylvania Agricultural Analytic Services. They have done the SME test in the past, but they won't do it on clay loam soils anymore right out of the high tunnel because it tends to clog their instruments. So I'm going to try to contact them again and try to encourage them to start. And if we could start asking our labs to include this test, we may start getting it down here, and it might be a good tool for us. AgriLabs in Delaware does do the test, so they're starting to do these tests. And this is just a good resource. This is also on the handout of different labs and their contact information, what they test for. If you're looking to compare labs, this is a good resource for you. So the other thing to have in mind when you're progressing into year 2 and beyond in high tunnel production is monitoring the nutrient salt buildup, or the soluble salts that are building in the soil. These come from animal-based composts and animal manure-based composts, which is a frequent. A lot of growers do use compost as a major amendment in their high tunnel, and if it's from an animal manure-based source, it can tend to build salts in the soil, so it's something to check for. High amounts exist if you're fertigating with chemical fertilizers. This can build soluble salts very quickly in the soil. The way, of course, to determine is through testing, and you have to test your soil and your water as well. We're going to talk about water analysis a little bit, but your water and the minerals in your water can also affect the soluble salt buildup in your high tunnel. One remedy is to expose the ground to rain. This is easier said than done. You do remove the plastic every once in a while, and you have the opportunity to, when you're changing plastic, you have the opportunity to leave it exposed for a while, but the timing has to be right, and I think a better way to look at this is to try to prevent the buildup to begin with. That's a good approach. So trying to monitor the amount of nutrients you're putting in, and we're going to show how to do that here in a minute, is helpful if you have this problem. But the other solution, or one other solution, is to try to dilute the soil. If you don't have a major salt buildup, you can dilute the soil with some field soil or with peat moss, which adds permanent organic matter to the soil also. And you can use vegetative-based composts as well, things like leaf and grass and vegetable-based compost instead of manure-based compost. Those are harder to come by and harder to find in quantity, but if you can use a combination of those three things to dilute the soil, and that will bring the parts per million, or however the salt's being measured, that'll bring them down in the soil. So that's one suggestion. So the other thing to be concerned about, of course, is the nitrate carryover. And the reasons you want to track the nitrate in the soil and how quickly it's accumulating are many. If it's too high, you can actually, if it's too high and it's actually running off, which is more of a concern in a field growing condition, it'll contribute to pollution in the waterways around your farm. But it does mean that you're applying too much and wasting money doing that. That's another reason not to have too much nitrate in the soil. It tends to collect in leafy greens, and that's been a concern if you're growing in the winter. The amount of nitrate concentration in the leafy greens that you're harvesting has been a concern for human health. The plants also become almost too succulent. Too much vegetative growth happens when there's too much nitrogen in the soil, and that leaves plants susceptible to diseases and pests, and you get less fruit development actually and lower yield when you have an excess of nitrogen. So there's a lot of good reasons to monitor this. If it's too low, of course, productivity and vigor of the plant will also suffer if it's too low. So many good reasons to monitor this. It can carry over from crop cycle to crop cycle because there's a minimum of flushing of this. In the field growing conditions, rain will flush it out, but of course in a high tunnel it will remain from crop cycle to crop cycle. And it comes, of course, from fertilizers, both organic and chemical, but it can also come from cover cropping. If you have a cover crop in, that can add to nitrates in the soil. Compost that's being mineralized can add to nitrates, and you can also, if you have a certain percentage of organic matter being measured, you can give yourself a contribution of nitrogen from that as well. And I spent some time in the original webinar from this spring talking about nutrient credits that you give yourself from cover crops and compost and organic matter. So if you're interested in that, you can watch that webinar. Here, it just suffices to say that they do contribute to the nitrogen buildup. And of course, testing is the way to figure out how much there is in the soil. Now, and then a solution would be exposing to rain or high amounts of irrigation, but both for soluble salts and nitrate buildup, you need quite a bit of rain or irrigation to actually start to flush them. So it would be more productive to try to keep from having the problem to begin with and monitor it closely so that you don't add too much nitrogen. And one way to do that is through the Pre-Sidedress soil nitrate test, PSNT. This was developed in the early 80s for corn production, but it's now being used for other crops as it's been studied for other crops, and recommendations have come out for other crops using this test. We can now use it for different vegetable crops. It is an accurate way to tell how much nitrogen is in the soil before you want to side dress and add more nutrients for a plant that's during the growing season. And the way to take a test is very similar to any other soil test. There are some specifics to it. And of course, in a large tunnel, you want to take between 10 and 15 samples of soil, or slices, meaning cross sections of the soil, to about a 12-inch depth. Mix those samples together very thoroughly, and then make sure you dry them for this test very quickly. You have to spread a cup or two of it out after it's been mixed on a very thin layer on a tray, and put a fan on it even to help dry it out, because moisture in the soil will promote biological activity in the soil, and that will eat up nitrate in the soil, so it'll throw your test off if you don't dry it very quickly. And you need about 1 cup to send into the lab, whatever lab you're working with. The timing of this is pretty specific. It's about 10 days before you want to side dress, and there's recommendations for different crops that I'm going to show you in a minute. But the real value comes from if you're able to keep records on your fertility inputs as compared to your nitrate side dress tests, and how your fertility plan is affecting the nitrates in the soil. So if you can keep records from year to year, you'll have a lot more to go on as far as what works and what doesn't in the following year. But as far as recommendations, and I'm sorry this is a bit blurry, this is taken from Dr. Joe Heckman's publication that's listed on the bottom here, Soil Nitrate Testing as a Guide to Nitrogen Management for Vegetable Crops, which you can access through that web link, and that's in your handouts. This is his recommendations as far as timing, and if you look at the crops that you see in high tunnels a lot, in winter growing, there's lettuce. So about 2 weeks after transplanting, you would want to utilize, I'm going to use my cursor here if you can see it, I'm on this line here. 2 weeks after transplanting, you would test for the lettuce, test the nitrate test for lettuce. In spinach, it would be at the 2 to 4 leaf stage. In peppers, tomatoes, and eggplant, you'd go at the first fruit set is when you would do your first testing. So that would give you enough time at that stage to get your samples back and adjust your side dressing of nitrogen accordingly to the recommendations. And here's the interpretation down at the bottom here. If you're less than 20 parts per million in nitrogen, it's likely you'll need it. From 20 to 24, you're sufficient for some crops. It's crop dependent. Not all crops need as much nitrogen, so you have to go by the recommendations of the lab according to the crop that you're growing. 25 to 30, right here. If you're in that range when this test comes back, you probably have sufficient nitrogen available for all of your crops. So that's another tool that you can use for managing the nutrients and not adding excessive amounts of nitrogen. And you're not adding them blindly if you get this test before you side dress. I know most of you are probably good at taking soil testing and doing soil testing, but I'm going to just make a few comments on soil testing. Pick a lab that you're comfortable with for the pre-Sidedress nitrogen test or nitrate test, and ones that will recommend for the crops that you're growing. If they can't give you specific recommendations for the crops that you want to grow in your high tunnel, then that's not a good lab to work with. The timing, we talked about a week or 10 days before you want to side dress, and we talked about the sampling and how to dry them. But use the experts and the testing lab recommendations. And here's a resource from our website at ATRA on the right-hand side of the screen here. We have an alternative soils testing laboratory database, and you can access that through our website. And that will give you an idea of other testing labs that you might be able to work with. Another minute on soil testing. This is someone taking a soil test in a high tunnel a few weeks ago with a spade. So she's using the spading method, making a V shape with a 12-inch spade, making a V shape in the soil, and then taking a slice right down one side of the V to get a nice composite of the whole soil profile for 12 inches. And this is perfectly acceptable. You want to try to use non-reactive tools for soil sampling so that you don't have a tainted sample from the tool that you're using. So a copper or a galvanized tool wouldn't be the ideal. And then dry them and send them to the lab. This is a tool I use for soil sampling. It's a small core sampler. Makes it very easy to take many samples throughout the high tunnel. And I did a lot of testing with this earlier this month. They sell them for under $60 at these two websites. And I think that's in your handout as well, those websites. So that can be a handy tool if you're doing a lot of soil sampling. So we said how important water becomes and irrigation becomes in these systems because every bit of water they see pretty much is from your irrigation system. And problems with your water can multiply because you're adding so much to the soils. And you want to take a sample of a water analysis for nutrients every year to make sure that nothing has changed. And if you're having some problems and trying to remedy them, you're going to have to take, samples more frequently than that. But the alkalinity of the water definitely can. The pH of the water will impact, how your pH of the soil is going to, whether it's going to rise or fall. So if you've got, I've been in contact with several growers up in New York who are having problems with their water raising the pH of the soil too high, and they're having to add sulfur to the soils more frequently because of their water, based on their water analysis. Hardness in the water can impact calcium and magnesium balancing, and it'll make availability of other nutrients for the plants it'll make it harder for plants to take other nutrients up if the magnesium and calcium are out of balance. So it definitely can have an impact in those terms, and you need to know what's coming out of your tap, or wherever your water source is for irrigation. There can also be other elements, including mineral salts and other things that affect the soluble salt levels. So if you're adding that to your soils and trying to figure out why your salt levels are high and it's coming from your water, and you're trying to reduce your amendments instead of looking at your water, you're looking at the wrong thing. So that's why it's important to actually know what's in your water. And of course, at high levels, there's toxicity to plants if you're talking about soluble salts. So again, working with a lab that will work with you. All those labs that I listed earlier do water analysis and are a good resource for this type of testing. So another tool that you have available is foliar testing. And this can be useful in a lot of different ways, but it's a very accurate telling of what the plant is actually able to bring up from the soil. So even though your soil tests might show that you have optimal nutrients and everything's in balance, your foliar testing sometimes will show that the plants aren't getting to those nutrients. So you may look at it might be an irrigation problem, lack of moisture at that point. It might point you to some compaction issues in the soil where the roots aren't able to get to the soil or to the nutrients that they need, even though they're in the soil. So it can point out problems like that, and the exact opposite can happen sometimes where the foliar test shows that the nutrients aren't being taken up by the plant, or rather the other way around. Nutrients are being taken up by the plant even though your soil tests have shown that everything isn't maybe at the optimal stage, and it just means that your roots are finding deeper and better they're going deeper into the soil and finding more nutrients than the soil tests were able to show you. So, so it's in conjunction with the soil tests, it can give you a better, accurate picture of what's going on in your high tunnel. It's also been used a lot for micronutrient adjustment. And because micronutrients are so hard to handle, normally they're in, there's plenty of quantity of micronutrients, but they're so important for certain stages of plant growth that it pays to know what plants are being able to take up from the soil. And you can make foliar feed adjustments or fertigation adjustments based on foliar testing of micronutrients and apply them more specifically than you could if you were trying to amend the soil with micronutrients. It's very easy to over-apply micronutrients when you're applying them to the soil. It doesn't take much when you're working with such small quantities to over-apply. So a lot of growers use foliar testing to keep track of their micronutrients and adjust those for their planting. And the real beauty of it is you can determine problems before symptoms actually start. And the key to foliar testing is to try to commit to several tests throughout the year or throughout the growing season so that you can catch a problem early and make adjustments so that you don't have impact on your yield. And that's how this is used most effectively, by committing to the test for 4 or 5 tests throughout the season so that you can make adjustments as needed and find something wrong before it actually shows symptoms of it and it's too late to try to bring the crop back. You are gathering materials for this testing, foliar materials, very specific to the type of plant that you're testing, and those recommendations can come from your lab. I think I have a slide here on, nope, I go right to soil-related diseases, but the type of plant you're testing for determines how and where you take the test. It's usually the last mature leaf that you're picking for the foliar test. So now I'll move on to this slide, soil-related disease, and we'll touch on this a bit here to finish this out. There's a lot of things that you can do to relieve disease and pest problems inside a high tunnel. We're going to focus, since this is a soils management type focus, we're going to focus on that. We're going to get into a few other things, but these are very common diseases that we find in high tunnels in the Northeast: leaf mold, tomato leaf spot, canker, verticillium wilt, and the mildews, powdery and downy. And very common to all of these are that, or almost all of them, are that they tend to carry over from season to season or crop to crop on debris, plant debris, weed debris, and any debris in the soil that hasn't been fully decomposed may carry these types of pathogens that create these diseases, lead to these diseases. So we want to look at some of the management practices that we can do to reduce the amount of disease in a high tunnel growing situation. Sanitation is number one and can have an impact, a big impact on disease control. If you are able to remove the debris of plants that have been infected with certain diseases and get them out of the high tunnel by and large, and then incorporate the rest of the debris that you weren't able to take out so that the biological life in the soil can break that down, you're getting ahead of the game as far as disease control. Here in this picture I see, it's fairly good clean as far as the in-row soils and the aisleway soils, but we have weed debris along the edge that I think could harbor both pests and diseases, and that if you have the time and labor, which is always the issue with high tunnel production, you could get that out of there, and it would be a better scene as far as this high tunnel is concerned. There's a few other problems here. I don't like the row cover right on the plant. That creates a condition where the plants can stay moist for longer periods of time, and foliar diseases can start. But as far as sanitation, the weeds are what I see most here. Crop rotation is a difficult one. It's one of the key tools for soil health, and it's also a great way to break up disease and pest cycles, but it's hard to implement in a high tunnel. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and give a resource on how to do some crop rotation here in a minute. Drip irrigation is a crucial way to irrigate for disease management. You don't want, the less you have water on the leaves and the surface of the plant, the less likely it is to have foliar diseases. A lot of foliar diseases grow in that moist environment, so if you can keep the leaves dry, that is an advantage, and drip irrigation helps do that. Of course, nutrient management comes into play in a big way. We've been focusing on nutrient management quite a bit, but nutrient management can help with disease, the impact of disease as well. For example, if you have a deficiency in magnesium, that can tend to start breaking down foliar, the leaves on the plant, and that doesn't cause disease in and of itself, but it creates a susceptibility in the plant to disease. So you end up having the plants much more susceptible to diseases and pests, for that matter, if you're not managing nutrients well. And in addition, if you have excess of certain nutrients like nitrogen, and the plants are overly succulent, that leaves them more susceptible to diseases and pests. I've heard it explained as what gout is like in the human system, where you have too much rich food and overabundance of rich food, and can lead to certain problems in the human system. So that's kind of what happens in a plant system as well. Adding organic matter can help, and that spurs on biological activity, which has been shown to some biological activity in the soil has been shown to suppress certain diseases, and it's not an exact science. There have been studies done on it, but it does help in certain cases, in certain situations, having that high organic matter and high biological activity. You can also expose to winter temperatures, and I said, this is easier said than done sometimes, especially if you're a winter grower and don't have the time to expose to winter temperatures. But some disease pathogens can't overwinter in very cold temperatures. Talking about residues a bit, you should try to keep them clean and clean out the residues from the former crop, and then incorporate whatever's left. This is a high tunnel down in southern Pennsylvania that they used a Sudan grass as a pre-cover crop to their winter growing in this tunnel. And Sudan grass has been shown to suppress certain fungal diseases in lettuce crops. So that's just a tidbit of information that I've come across that I want to investigate a little further. But Sudan grass does have that suppression capability for fungal diseases, especially in lettuce. So I mentioned irrigation quite a few times and how important it is. The type of soil structure, and all of that will determine kind of the depth of the watering and the root, and thus the root zone. But your management of the soil, of the irrigation system rather, will also determine that, and how closely you monitor how much you're putting on. If you overwater, of course, you're going to flush nutrients out of the root zone. Underwatering won't put enough nutrients in solution for the plants to actually uptake. So it's fairly important to monitor it closely. Increase soil organic matter, and I know I'm talking a lot about soil organic matter, but that's a very important part of soil health. It also helps hold more water. So that can even out your irrigation watering, so that you don't need quite as much water if you have the soil organic matter up. A side note, certain soils in high tunnels could become hydrophobic, meaning they are very hard to re-moisten. They become crusty and hydrophobic in certain conditions. The solution to that is add small amounts of water many times throughout the day, and that will rehydrate rather than a large amount of water that tends to just run off of a soil that's in that condition. Mulch can also help control your moisture in these systems, and a lot of high tunnel growers are relying on mulch to control evaporation, but it's also a disease barrier. So soil-borne diseases can't get to your plants if you've got the ground covered. They can't get to the plants as easily. It reduces, like I mentioned, evaporative water loss in these systems. It also increases organic matter mineralization. So it makes more nutrients available from organic matter in the soil if you've got black plastic mulch on. That tends to increase the microbial activity in the soil. It can reduce soluble salt movement toward the soil surface because you have that lack of evaporative action going on. So cover crops inside the tunnel are hard. This is valuable space. A lot of growers are trying to get a high-value crop, and intensively planted high-value crop inside the tunnel. Some growers are growing summer and winter, so it makes it hard to get a cover crop introduced. But you can use a few strategies like undersowing, especially if you're not using mulches. If you are, you can remove the mulch toward the end of the growing season for, say, a tomato crop, and try to undersow with a fast-growing or quick-growing cover crop, such as rye or oats or field peas or buckwheat. All of those grow fairly quickly. They're fairly easy to incorporate before the next crop needs to be planted, and you get a cover crop in your rotation that way sometimes. Others choose to take a tunnel out of production, like this picture here, and dedicate it to a cover crop for a certain period of time. And there's value in that if you can afford to do it. Again, cover crops and rotation are one of the best ways to build soil health and to break up disease and pest cycles. So trying to get back to a cover cropping and rotation regime on your farm is something that's going to help you in the long run. This is a book here that I'm showing from NESARE that is accessible through this website. It's about managing cover crops profitably. This picture is a picture of buckwheat cover crop in a high tunnel up in New York, where they were just, I think they had eggplant in here that came out, and they put a quick buckwheat cover crop in before they were getting ready for the fall planting of lettuces. So it can be done. It's a hard thing to incorporate, but try to fit them in here and there as you can. So rotations, these are very crucial to organic systems. They're required in organic systems of production. They're very challenging because of the value of the space, like I mentioned, for cover crops, and the limited amount of high-value crops that you can grow in these tunnels. A lot of tunnel growers are growing tomatoes alone because that's kind of the highest value crop you can grow in this structure. But there are certain ways to think about rotations and try to get back into them. If you have one tunnel, of course, you can rotate through beds if you have multiple crops. You can use the beds as little fields and rotate through the beds and get a small rotation going that way. Of course, 2 or more tunnels are helpful with rotations because you can rotate between tunnels. And we'll mention this at the end again, but movable tunnels can help with rotations as well. It opens up more space to actually incorporate a rotation in your cropping system. And if you think about it here on the right-hand side, the families of crops that are used for high tunnel production, these aren't all very, very high value crops, but some of them are valuable enough to grow in high tunnels. And if you're a winter grower, you have more options as well. The leafy greens, of course, are grown over the winter, and you can move from a leafy green the first winter to a tomato or other solanaceous crop the following summer, and then you can move back into a brassica or Asian greens of some sort for the following winter, and then the following summer you can go back into a cucurbit. Instead of going back to a solanaceous, you could go into the cucurbit family and get a cucumber crop or a melon crop going. So there are some options. Not all of these are equally marketable or equally profitable, but it's a starting point for some ideas on how to rotate through a high tunnel system and get at least 4 different families going. And then if you can incorporate some cover cropping in between these, you have even more of a diversity in your rotation. So this is a great, this is a site from NESARE as well down at the bottom of this slide on crop rotations on organic farms, which is a very nice resource. It's also included in the handout. So if we go to insect management, there are some very similar things to disease management and some separate things as well. Starting with a healthy soil, and I know this is said a lot, but it is true that the healthier the soil, the more easy access to those nutrients, the deeper the loam of the soil, the more air channels and aggregates that are formed, the better your plants are going to do all the way around, and the less susceptible they're going to be to insect and disease pressure. Here's a crop in a high tunnel. It's not a great picture of it, but it was infested with aphids. It's a cucumber crop in a high tunnel this year. I took a few weeks ago that is infested with aphids, and the soil tests came back from this tunnel very, very high in nitrates. So high nitrogen in a tunnel will make aphid and mite infestation more of a likelihood. So that's why nutrient management is also a very important part of insect management. Sanitation, again, same as we talked about for the disease management, is very crucial because sometimes these insects can overwinter on debris in the soil that's left in the high tunnel. The main strategies are to encourage beneficials into the high tunnel. One way to do that is to not use broad spectrum sprays that will kill your beneficials as well as the pest. Try to rely on biological controls that are specific to the pests that you're trying to deal with. That would be other beneficial insects that you're introducing or that you're encouraging. You can try to prevent entry through screening of the end walls and the roll-up sides. That is somewhat effective, but it also keeps beneficials out, and it's a lot of time and labor on the farms that I've seen it implemented. The main thing is introducing beneficials specific to the pests that you are trying to battle, and use insectary crops like yarrow and dill and those types of pollinators that'll attract beneficials, pollinating plants that'll attract beneficial insects into your high tunnel space. You can do that in as small an area as 10 by 10, or have it spread out throughout the high tunnel. You can introduce those types of crops to bring beneficials in. But you can't reduce your scouting and monitoring either. You need to put out your yellow sticky traps. Know how much of what insect is out there and keep up your scouting and monitoring throughout the season as well, and implement IPM controls when needed. These are very common: whiteflies, spider mites, aphids, thrips in high tunnel production. These are some of the main ones, and I can say, some of them are more prevalent in like dry conditions. For instance, your whiteflies and aphids, or rather mites and aphids, appear in the high tunnel when it gets dry. So keeping the humidity a bit higher, if those are your insect problems, might be a good strategy. Now, the high humidity could contribute to foliar diseases, so you have to have the right conditions in order to try that. But you can, again, maintain populations of beneficial predatory insects in the house and use biorational pesticides that are very specific to the type of pest that you're going to try to impact. I wanted to mention slugs. It can be a problem, especially if you're mulching inside this high tunnel and inside your high tunnel, and moisture isn't being controlled. They like high moisture areas, and mulch is perfect for that kind of living condition for these guys. A story about this high tunnel on the left-hand side here. It's a New York grower that was put up this high tunnel, and he had a French drain along this one side, but he didn't have it on the other side of the tunnel. And this was getting rid of the water off this side of the tunnel and keeping it dry. The other side of the tunnel was getting moist just inside, and he had a terrible slug problem inside the other side of the tunnel. And he figured if he had it to do over again, he would have put drains on both sides of the tunnel, because it's a problem that he's going to battle continuously, along with other moisture issues. This isn't a soil-related thing, but I wanted to mention ventilation because it's so important to the management of these tunnels. Some growers ventilate 24/7, especially in summertime, but even winter producers will leave a vent open, like you see this gable vent here, for 24/7 throughout the entire winter, in order to reduce the amount of foliar diseases that occur with high humidity. It becomes a very big problem in the summer as far as temperature control, or a very big tool for temperature control. And you want to face your high tunnel for summer production in a northwest orientation, so that you get cross breeze from the predominant west cross breeze. That's one strategy for reducing temperature and humidity in the summertime. For winter production, the east-west orientation is preferable, because you get more solar gain because of that. As far as ventilation is concerned, I'm involved, just as an aside, I'm involved in a Northeast SARE project right now that I just wanted to mention to everybody. It's a heat recover ventilation project. I'm installing a heat recovery ventilator, which is a ventilation unit that exchanges the heat with indoor air with the outdoor air. So I'm going to install one of these in a high tunnel and see if I can't increase the average daily temperature for winter production in the high tunnel using this very simple low energy unit. And if I get enough growth with disease control, because you'll be able to close up the rest of the tunnel and not have to ventilate it, that's the theory, you'll be able to get the average daily temperature up in the tunnel while maintaining humidity control. So that's a project that I'm kind of excited about, that I'm working on with a farm down in southern Pennsylvania on. And you can go to the Northeast SARE website and find my write-ups about it. I'll be performing that over this winter, and next spring I'll be coming out with the results of it. So that's might be a new way to start ventilating a high tunnel, hopefully. Of course, roll-down sides are another option that some growers are using so you have less wind impact on the plant itself, but you're able to ventilate at the same time. And just a brief word on high tunnels, or on movable tunnels, because we are up on the hour here. They very effectively, well, they basically double your growing space. It's not exactly a true statement, but you can grow under cover. You can grow about twice the amount of area, which is going to be under cover part of the time, at least part of the season, with a movable tunnel. And it helps you expose the soils to rain, which can help with nutrient and soil salt buildups. And you also can work in rotations and cover crops a lot more easily because you have more space to do that. And you also can work those uncovered areas more easily, depending on your equipment and what you're using for equipment. Sometimes it's very helpful to have that tunnel out of the way. They do cost a third more of the cost of a regular tunnel, and they need to be very well anchored. Some farmers don't trust them because they rely on earth anchors or other such anchors to hold them down, and wind can be a detriment to these types of tunnels. So you got to weigh and measure. Okay, these are some high tunnel website resources that are very useful. They're in your handout. There's our ATRA soil management publication. Hightunnels.org is a very nice resource for high tunnel growers. Cornell University has a nice section on high tunnels, and also the University of Michigan down at the bottom there, or University of Vermont has a nice high tunnel manual that's a very good resource. I just wanted to throw them out there, and these are in your handout that's attached here. And in case you don't know about it, one last thing I always mention is the NRCS High Tunnel Program, which is still in swing. It's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Through that EQIP program, they will offer financial assistance for up to 2,100 square feet of high tunnel. So they'll pay up to 2,178 square feet of high tunnel space. They'll buy that space of high tunnel, pay for it on your farm. To get into an NRCS contract, you can contact NRCS, your local NRCS, through the website that's listed down at the bottom of this slide. And this, I believe, I also included in the handout. So that's what I have for you. Thank you very much for attending. And I don't see any questions at the moment. I'm going to double check here to make sure there are no questions. And I don't see any, but I really appreciate everyone who had attended, and please feel free to contact me directly, or I will be checking out the message board on the Capital RC&D High Tunnel website to see if you have any questions about my talk on there as well.
Excellent.
Cheryl?
Chris, thank you so much for putting this together, and for taking time out of your schedule to present today. For everyone participating in the webinar, thank you for joining us today. We'll leave it open here for some questions. And also, if you have questions after the webinar now, or after reviewing the recording, you can email Chris directly, or use the High Tunnel Forum to post questions to fellow growers. Thank you. Oh, here we go. Okay. For those that are still on, the handout is available in the tab in your interface, and we'll also be sending that out. I'll send out an email with the link for an evaluation. It's always great to hear what you think of our current programming, and it's also excellent to hear what you need to know or would like to know, so that we can pull speakers and presenters that can provide you with that information. So, Chris, thank you again.
Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today.
Yeah, it's on behalf of Capital RC&D. It's always our pleasure to be able to assist growers and to help people with the knowledge, like you, Chris, to interface with those that need the information. So we appreciate it. So.
Great. Yeah, and I'm open for questions anytime. If they, for those of you who are still on, if anyone thinks of something down the road, just shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
going to go ahead and stop